tapping the cable. Hello, nice to meet all of you. My name is Juliana Boudakian. I am a senior front-end engineer here at Mobile. So I'm in-house. And I wanted to talk to you about some experience. So this is a presentation slash just a therapy moment for all of us together here. Things that I wish people told me, or the things that did hear from people when I started developing and just all throughout the years and have made the biggest difference. So those topics, well, I should have gone with dark mode. This is a lot. So naming, sharing code, and debugging. I wanted to talk about these topics because I feel like they're topics who usually get overlooked, and then you find yourself in the middle of your task and you're like, I have no idea what I'm doing. We usually focus on bigger topics and languages and models and architecture, and then on our day-to-day, we lack the details to make something which is really easy to share, easy to work with. So that's what I wanted to talk about. And I want all of us to take different perspectives from this, right? If you are someone that does not struggle with with light mode, I envy you. Everything on my computer is black. So it's just this one is really like, does not like me.
Should I just turn all the lights again?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Maybe
Sorry. I almost prefer that.
if this gets too much, then we just close our eyes and listen, like a podcast. It's fine. It's fine. We can get through this. We all have seen a friend share a screen. You're like, Jesus Christ, change your ID. I wanted all of us to take it from different perspectives. So a lot of this comes from helping other people in the company, in my team, things that they struggle with, and I see patterns. So a lot of this is through the perspective of someone who is more senior. A lot of this can be also from perspective of someone who just needs the support. And even if you don't need it, you can also help somebody that does need it. So take this as tips for yourself or tips for people around you to help them move better. And also have more independence, which I feel like it's important when we are writing code. First thing I want to talk about is naming. And I would like to get a show of hands, regardless where you are in your career, how many people here have struggled to write a name of a variable, a function? You're like, I have no idea. There you go. There you go. If you're like, look around, everybody has. It is the paradigm of the coding world. I have talked to people who have over 30 years of experience and will name things items. It happens to everybody. This is a safe space. But we're going to talk about some things to help you navigate that. So we should always do clear things. You should be able to look at a function, look at a variable without many hours trying to understand the logic. So for functions, I kind of compiled 3 of the main buckets that I see for naming. So the first one being handle. Functions, they have verbs, right? So language, as the name says, it is a language. It imitates how we talk. And that is, I think, an overall good idea to have when you're reading code. It is a language, so you should be able to read it clearly. I would say 99.99% of them have verbs. If you do have a function without a verb, I would love to hear it because I cannot see it. I try to think of anyone that I like, maybe no function in this, I couldn't. So if you have an example, share it with me. I would love to know. So the first one, handle. So handle something, you probably seen this before, brackets with the 3 dots, put your name in it. So basically saying handle is a function triggered usually by an action. So you would see a lot in front-end developing if you have something on the screen, which creates an action, a button to click, submit. So for example, handle click, handle submit. Those are things where we usually use handle. Again, with English, something happens and then you handle the situation. It mimics the way we speak. The second one is format and parse. So receives pieces of information and then returns them in your desired format. Last one that I have here is get, fetch, and set. So usually manipulating information, data, get cars, fetch listings, set filter. So I will say these are the biggest buckets that I have seen writing code. Honorable mention to use. If you use React and you're familiar with hooks, everything has use effect, use state, use. So it is kind of like a tool belt. You use something, a pocket of information, a pocket of tasks. All functions have verbs, but some variables also have verbs. So in the case of Booleans, usually if you see a variable with a verb, it is a Boolean. So has is questions that are answered with yes or no, Boolean, true or false. And then a couple of examples, has membership, is adult, can drive. Then we have variables in plural. Don't critique me here. I did not add all the English cases for irregular verbs. You're gonna have to Google that one. I didn't have enough space and time. I was an English teacher at some time ago. Not planning on going back. So we're gonna stick to regular plural for this. So words that end with S, it is to assure that you know that it is a list, it is an array, multiple items within one variable. And then some general rules. So with variables, it is difficult to find patterns because it is dependent on your context, and it should. If you're able to identify buckets in all of your systems, maybe that's the problem. I would look into that because there are probably generic terms like items. I have been victim of this. Don't judge me. I have written a lot of maps and filters and fors with element and items and list, but that's not good. Don't do that. So general rules, use camel case. So like the back of a camel, up and down. Keep it straightforward as possible. So I would like to give you 2 examples, and I want you to either vote 1 or 2 with your hands. So I'm going to use this as an example. If I want to store this controller on a variable, I could say const, because we're not going to change it, const controller that when I click, it does the thing on the slider when it works, because sometimes it doesn't work, but it does work now, so that's good. That's number 1. Number 2, slider controller. Can I get a 1 or a 2? 2, 2, 2? 2? There are always more options. But the point being, you don't want to use that, when, with, then, can. So we usually stick to things like possessive. I swear this is not supposed to be an English lesson, but for this, we're going to bear here with me. Possession, right? So it is not the controller that controls the slides. It is the slider controller. Switcheroo. And that's going to make it more easy, and you're not going to have a const that you're hoping, like we saw in the last presentation. Please fill the rest, because I have no idea how to write it, and you're depending on your IDE to fill the name. So these are some usual buckets and patterns that I have seen, and that it helps when you're reading code and when you're writing. Because if you see some of the verbs, you know already is a Boolean. If you're working with JavaScript, things like this can help you because you cannot hover over it and get the answer. So some ideas. Next thing, sharing components. Now, this is the question, share or not share. And I realized that whenever I'm looking at, especially bigger code bases, and you end up seeing code that should not be shared, or code that you see 5 components that look the same and just have one small difference, and you're like, this probably should be shared. So we're going to talk about when to share it and when not to share it. So I said it was therapy. We are sharing first, always share. The first level would be a base level. So it is a base for a bigger implementation. Much like flour, you don't eat flour, okay? No, wheat flour at least, but you use it to bake a cake, for example. So it is a base. It is not as its own thing enough that is a completely shareable component, because it is an ingredient for something that is bigger. Some examples: a select, drop down, combo box, your preferred name for this component. I realized today that everybody calls it differently. So this thing where you click it and then it goes down. A button, an input, a checkbox, a link, ingredients. Second level is reinforcement. So it is something which needs to be in all places. I think the most common example would be a header or a footer. You want it to be everywhere the same. You share it with the other pages. And then a generic one. So presenting multiple places with minimal change. I use here an example of a FAQ, basically where your structure is the same. The content is the difference, but there's no rules. It is basically showing information, and you want the design to be the same everywhere. It is a great option to share. And then quick search. I don't know if everybody is familiar with the name quick search, but basically a collection of buttons that you're gonna search, and it's basically a generic thing. So you're gonna have, regardless of the context, there's no thing which changes by where it is. Now, these are the good examples when to share it, and then we have the don't share it. So some things are meant to keep personal, these being some of them. So special cases, special business rules. You have sometimes components which have a very specific case. So if it is a Sunday, if it is 2:30 p.m., if you stepped out of your bed with your first right feet, then your left feet. It is very, very specific. There's no reason to share it. An example from our company is how it works. So it's a section explaining how to lease a car. We have so many different ownership modules in Mobila. It is very specific to this leasing case. It doesn't make sense to share it. And singular, only present in one context. So for example, we have here Mobila, the vehicle highlights. If you go to the VAP, so the vehicle information page, you will see it's a component that only has in that page. It doesn't need to be shared. We can keep it in the context and prevent it from being handled in everything that is not required. And then complex functionality. So I think an easy example would be everybody has maybe bought some clothes online or bought something maybe in Kleinanzeigen. Maybe. Quick plug. And you have to select maybe a size. Maybe you have to select a color, something like that. So you have a lot of functionality, a flow of information. You have a lot of different changes within a component. If you don't want to, if you share it, you would need to have a lot of maintenance and a lot of checks and a lot of monitoring because it is such a complex functionality. If you have to do it, you have to do it, but we avoid it. Now, these share it and don't share it are cases and things that I have seen personally. A lot about don't sharing and sharing, it is about preventing duplication of code, which is also something that you can lose track of it, especially in bigger companies with a lot of feature teams. It can get out of hand. So with this information, it's always nice to have documentation with it. Boo, documentation. We have to do it. So having a clear knowledge of what you have, what you don't have, and then also communicating with other teams to know, is this something that maybe you would like to use? A lot of times, more than one team is doing the same component. It happens. And then you get to the release and you're like, wait, it is the same thing. So having a notion of this and maybe thinking of the possible use cases can also help you determine if you want to share a component or not. And because sometimes you share it and then it goes wrong, and then the big monster of debugging comes to your door, and then you have to figure it out. Now, to be honest, this is probably my favorite topic to talk about, because I feel like I have experienced people with different levels of experience, senior, medium level, junior, who have a really hard time debugging. And maybe debugging, not even as something went wrong, but I think debugging is also about learning how to work with existing code. So I think a lot of documentation that we see is always the hello world, is always the beautiful, field of flowers, butterflies case, and then you get to your day-to-day and then realize that sometimes you have to touch legacy code, sometimes you have to touch really complex a pile of code, and you have to figure out how to do it. And when you go to documentation, and actually I was talking to a colleague today about how I think we end up, and I know it is a joke, that we all go to Stack Overflow. No shame. But it is because it is real life people using in real life situations. So it is easier to relate when you see it in a bigger context, when you see it in the middle of other things being broken by other libraries or other things. That is the real example. And debugging is all about that. It's about being thrown in the situation and figuring out how to get out of it. So to me, this is the most important skill that I learned. And my developing journey became like a getting out of a war situation. I was like, I have to learn how to get out of trouble, then I'll learn how to do it correctly. That's the first thing I have to learn. So I have brought here today a very personal thing. It is a dump of my brain when it comes to debugging. So welcome. It's a bit less, I would say I would have to add more memes and maybe some background music, but you get the gist of it. So I kind of compiled a guide for debugging. And this is for not to prevent you to ask for help, because I think that's important, but also for you to maybe get a sense of how to move it and how to move through the code by yourself, questions that you could ask, ways that you could go about it. So you feel like you're not just, as soon as something happens, you're like, help, I have no idea what I'm doing. So I will invite you to walk with me here. Don't stand up. The first one is, are you really testing your code? And this might seem like a weird question, but again, can I get a show of hands? Who was like, cached information, didn't save a file, was looking at the wrong place? There you go. It's nice to see all of us together here today. I would say save first, ask later, or like save first, freak out later. I have lost count of how many times I asked a colleague to help me, and they were like, I see a little dot in your IDE, which means you did not save your file. And I was like, oh no. Here we go. And then you save, and then it works. So if it does work, good for you. You're free to go. You're out of the brain flow. Next up, check each step of the flow. Make sure it's going through. Now, I feel like this is the most important thing when you're looking at code, and not even debugging, but just creating your code, is knowing every step. So I think it's also something that we do usually if you're familiar with rubber ducks, right? So it's the concept where you have a colleague that maybe just ask you questions. They sometimes don't even help you with a solution, but we can get kind of in a loop of doing the same thing and not seeing, maybe like not seeing a semicolon, which happens a lot. We take prettier extensions in the IDE for that. But sometimes when you go and look at each step and you debug each step, meaning whatever is easier for you, if that is logging the information, if it is adding a breakpoint, whatever works for you, for your IDE, how you like to interact with your code, making sure that every step is making what you want it to make. And a lot of the times you find it, okay, actually there's this line of code which is not doing what I want it to do. So as soon as you can identify what's breaking, you can identify what you should do. But if you say, everything seems to be working, I don't find anything, so we're going to the right. Not yet. So is there a service being called? So let's say that you're calling an API outside of your scope, inside of your scope, you're just calling a service. Is there a code or a clear message? By clear, I mean not a 500. That's like the default, oops, 500. If you do have a clear code, then again, you identify where this is coming from. You can take a look at some documentation, HTTP request code, because nobody remembers all of the codes. And if you do, nice. But I don't. I have to go. I know 404. I know 401. And then, but if you don't have a clear message, that means it's something that you're not going to be able to easily figure out. Now, it is not all lost. We have a couple of options. What I like to do personally is find the nearest backend developer and cry. But you can also find the nearest swagger, also try individually. It can be something that's causing by you. It can be something that's being caused by the service itself. Again, it's about granulating what you're doing so you can identify better with each step. Things like examples of the service. This is something that I also kind of get it in my head all the time. If you can find an example of the same service being called, if it is the same API endpoint, that's perfect. But sometimes even an example of the same service being called, even if it's a different API endpoint, you can figure things out like what is the request has to look like, maybe headers, maybe tokens. You get a general idea of what it should look like. I mentioned the Swagger. Also looking at your browser tabs. So for example, the network tab, looking, do I have powered by? So you can know where the error is coming from. Maybe you can see the response. Maybe you get some more information there. Or looking at your console, if it's completely red, just like my t-shirt, you probably can get an idea of what's going on. If there's still nothing after all of this reading and poking your backend developer and trying to get it, I would say maybe ask now for an expert. Maybe not the backend developer that couldn't help you. Maybe if you have access to the person that developed the API, that's the best. We're going to get back to you. We're going to go back. So we're going to go up there. Is the issue UI related? Now, similar to turn off and on again, which is the first rule of anyone, you should always turn off and on again. I even heard my grandfather saying that you need to open the door of the car and close again. Bless his heart. Deleting the node modules is like the go-to. No, I feel like no front-end developer I ever ask for help talks to me before I do that. They're like, have you? No, talk to me later. It's like saying hi. It's the polite thing to do. Delete your node modules, install again, then we can talk. And again, looking at your browser tabs, elements, again, console. We were having a conversation earlier about you write CSS and then you look at your console or like your elements and it looks completely different. Some things are ignored. So that's usually how you can find out as well if something is wrong or not. If you still haven't found anything, we're going to get to how to ask for help. Now, this one thing that I like when I have UI issues is, and this is something that I learned when I started learning HTML, just put like a border in pink. Works like a charm. Sometimes you're lost and you're like, I think this is here, but I have no idea where this is going. A pink border, a background color, or if it's text, put a big X on it. That's what people that I learned with mentors, my dad who also works with IT, put an X. It was similar to the node modules. Have you put an X? No, then let's think about it later. And then we have sometimes logic-related issues. So not a service, not UI. Let's say that you have to write something like the functions we talked before, a parse function, a format function. Again, granular things. So whenever you look at the big picture, you're never going to get the details of what you're doing. So the closer you look, the better you can identify what you're doing. So again, outlining each step, I think is also good. Sometimes we try to write it in less lines. So you just chain everything up. So dot map, dot join, dot filter, dot, and then you kind of get lost on what's happening. So trying to separate that and seeing what happens in each step, then you can see where something might be going wrong. If none of this gets you an idea, or maybe if it got you an idea, but you still have no idea how to deal with it, then let's ask for help. But I wanted to show this because I think that sometimes when something goes wrong, we can get sometimes frozen and not know what to do, and immediately go into, I did something wrong, this is broken, I have messed things up. And it's really about first thinking what you're doing and realizing that no matter how much experience you have, you will always break something. My colleague, he's almost a principal engineer. He was fixing a prod bug today. So he has, I think, over 30 years of experience. It happens to everybody. You're always going to be junior at something. And it doesn't matter if you're senior for 30 years, you're going to be junior at something. You can be an expert in React and not know, I forgot the name, Rust. Rust, right? You can be the best at React and be like, what is this? I have no idea. It looks different. So I wanted to talk to you about this because I feel like we should take off the stigma of asking for help. You need to feel confident in yourself to at least try and not depend on everybody, but it is completely fine to ask for help. And especially if you ask for help after you have tried. That is the best, right? So I have here how to ask for help. And this is something that I also learned, both to ask for help for Google and for a colleague. You never ask in a blank statement, help, SOS, 500 if you're that person. You have to give them context, right? This goes for two things. First, to show the person that you're asking for help that you actually try to do something. Shows that what you have done, it is important. You have checked other things. And it also helps them where to start. So if you come to ask for help and say, hey, I deleted my node modules and I installed it again. I did this. I took a look at that. I put an X. I did a big pink border in my component. I have no idea. Then the person that's going to help you, okay, I don't have to ask for those things. I can go deeper into whatever's happening. We can tackle it. And it also helps giving them context, right? Where you are, what are you touching, what is the language, what's going on. So for asking for a colleague, so where is the issue? Meaning a component, a page, a library, a hook, something. What is the error message, if you have any? If you have 500, say for 500, because it also helps. It eliminates some things. But if you have a message like, say, for example, you have a 401, you have a 404, tell them what it is. What have you tried? Going through your steps. One thing I like to do when I ask for help is I say, I need help. Let me walk you through what I did, and then we can continue from that. So, hey, I started here. I went through here. Now, this is where I got stuck. So how do we go about it? What are your assumptions? Sometimes even if we don't fix it, we kind of have an idea maybe of what could be. I saw a colleague that talked about this, or when I was Googling it, I saw an article about this, if it helps. And then where did you stop? So what was the final blocker that made you ask for help? And then we also have how to ask Google, because I think that's very important. This is kind of like an order, and I actually learned this before I learned a lot of very big concepts in programming, but language, version, library, error message. So for example, Next.js, v14, React image gallery, sure, 404, or image could not load, something like that. So you kind of go from big to small, and you give more context, and you want to use, again, similar to the variables where we don't want to use that when we want to keep it to specific words, because that is what we want the search engine to take. So, but it is all about giving context and also communicating whatever you have done, whatever you have found. When I talk to developers, mainly junior developers, I think there's a notion that you should know things, and there's this thing of it's understood, which I think it's a bit crazy, because developing is such a big scope, and I feel like everybody here probably knows something that the person next to you doesn't know, and vice versa. Every version of the language, every week there's a new update, and it's impossible not to know everything. So don't feel pressure about asking for help, and also understand that maybe when somebody is asking for help, they already are feeling pressure. So we have to kind of be aware of that when we are in those situations, talking to people that are being vulnerable and asking for help. So main takeaways that I would like to give it to you if you have not memorized everything. So in short, naming things in a way that requires minimal code reading to understand what it is about, kind of like a short look into it. Sharing should help, not complicate. So if it requires too much work and maintenance, it's probably not a good idea. And I think that's a good way to decide. And debugging, check your steps. It is okay to ask for help and give context to who you are asking for support. I think the most important thing through this presentation, what I wanted to pass is that I think the best thing about developing, especially with other people, is making sure that once you go through that, nobody else has to go through the same trouble. So whether that is writing code in a way that it doesn't require people to spend an hour figuring out what the function does, whether that is making sure that nobody has to develop the same component again, or if it is sometimes making sure that you add comments to explain things which are not easily understandable. If you're developing an endpoint, you want to give clear messages to help people if they have problems. Making sure that, we code a path through the forest, cutting leaves and stones so others can hike. Thank you.